In February 2009, a woman walking her dog in the New Mexico desert made a discovery that would unveil one of America's most disturbing serial killer cases. What started as a single bone protruding from the sand would lead investigators to unearth the remains of 11 women, scattered across 92 acres of mesa. But these weren't random victims. All of them had vanished between 2001 and 2005. All of them had been carefully chosen. And all of them had been watching their killer long before he chose them. This is the story of the West Mesa Bone Collector, a predator who turned Albuquerque's desert into his personal graveyard. A killer who knew his victims' routines, their vulnerabilities, their desperation. A killer who, to this day, may still be watching, still hunting, still collecting. Ross, the woman that was walking her dog, lived in a suburban neighborhood close to the desert, a place where residents would sometimes walk their dogs or enjoy the open space. Little did she know that her routine walk that day would unravel one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. As Ross walked her dog through the desolate, sandy terrain, something unusual caught her dog's attention. Upon closer inspection, Ross realized that her dog had discovered what appeared to be a human bone. Unsure at first, she snapped a photo of the bone and sent it to her sister, a nurse, to get her opinion. Her sister confirmed her worst suspicions: it was a human femur. Ross immediately contacted the Albuquerque police, who rushed to the scene. When they arrived and began investigating, what they found was beyond anyone's imagination. As police began to dig in the soft, sandy ground of the mesa, they uncovered more human remains. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just one body buried in the desert, there were multiple remains scattered across a vast area. Over the following weeks, forensic teams meticulously combed through the site, unearthing the remains of 11 women and a fetus, all buried in shallow graves. The skeletal remains were scattered over a large area, making the recovery process slow and painstaking. Investigators quickly realized that they were dealing with a mass grave, a discovery that would send shockwaves through Albuquerque and beyond. As the remains were identified, a heartbreaking picture began to emerge. The victims, all female, ranged in age from 15 to 32. Most were Hispanic, and many had been reported missing between 2001 and 2005. These women had all disappeared during a 4-year period, their fates unknown until Christine Ross's chance discovery in 2009. The police identified the victims through dental records and other forensic methods. As the names and faces of the victims came to light, a troubling commonality emerged: most of the women had been involved in sex work or had links to drug use. Many of them had lived on the margins of society, making them vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Among the victims was 15-year-old Celia Edwards, the only African-American victim in the group. Celia was a runaway from Lawton, Oklahoma, who had been living on the streets before she disappeared. Her young age and tragic circumstances made her case particularly heart-wrenching, highlighting the vulnerability of young women in dangerous situations. The victims included Veronica Romero, Michelle Valdez, Victoria Chavez, Darren Marquez, Julie Neo, Monica Candelaria, Virginia Cloven, Celia Edwards, Evelyn Salazar, Jamie Barrell, and Cinnamon Elks. These women had disappeared without a trace, their families left in agony, wondering what had happened to them. Many of the families had reported their loved ones missing years earlier, but with few leads, the cases had gone cold. Some of the families had even suspected that their daughters and sisters had met with foul play, but with no evidence, their disappearances remained unsolved until the bodies were discovered. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through Albuquerque, a city that had long struggled with issues related to crime and poverty but had never seen anything on this scale. Families who had spent years searching for their missing loved ones were finally given answers, but the pain of their loss was immeasurable. The news was devastating, not only to the families but also to the entire community, as residents grappled with the horrific reality that a serial killer or killers had been operating in their midst for years. The West Mesa murders highlighted a painful truth: many of these women had been living on the fringes of society, and their disappearances had not received the attention they deserved. The case underscored the vulnerability of women involved in sex work, who often face violence and exploitation but are less likely to have their disappearances thoroughly investigated. This tragedy sparked conversations about the need to protect society's most vulnerable and to prioritize missing persons cases regardless of their backgrounds. In the aftermath of the discovery, vigils and memorials were held to honor the victims. The community came together to mourn the loss of these women and to demand justice for them. Families of the victims spoke out, sharing the pain of their years-long search for answers and expressing hope that the case would one day be solved. The investigation into the West Mesa Bone Collector case was one of the largest and most complex in Albuquerque's history. Dozens of detectives were assigned to the case, and the FBI was called in to assist. The task was daunting, not only were investigators dealing with multiple victims, but they were also working with skeletal remains, which made it difficult to determine exactly how the women had died. Some of the bodies had been in the ground for years, complicating the forensic analysis. The first step for investigators was to try to piece together a timeline of when the victims had gone missing. This was no easy task, as many of the women had lived transient lifestyles, making it difficult to determine when they had last been seen. However, through interviews with family members, friends, and others who knew the victims, investigators were able to establish that most of the women had disappeared between 2001 and 2005. Next, investigators had to consider how the women had ended up in the West Mesa. The area where the bodies were found was relatively remote at the time of the murders, but it had been undergoing development in the years leading up to the discovery. Police considered the possibility that the killer or killers had taken advantage of the desolate landscape to dispose of the bodies, assuming that the area wouldn't be developed for some time. Despite an extensive investigation, no arrests have been made in connection with the West Mesa murders. Over the years, multiple suspects have been examined, but none have been definitively linked to the crime. One of the primary suspects in the West Mesa case was a local man named Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya had a history of violence against women and had been involved in several disturbing incidents in the years leading up to the discovery of the bodies. In 2006, Montoya was killed in a confrontation with a woman he had allegedly abducted and was attempting to kill. The woman's boyfriend arrived just in time, shooting Montoya in self-defense. After Montoya's death, investigators began to examine whether he could have been responsible for the West Mesa murders. Montoya had lived just a few miles from the burial site, and his violent history made him a prime suspect. However, despite extensive investigation, no concrete evidence has been found linking Montoya to the murders. The fact that Montoya was killed in 2006, several years before the bodies were discovered, further complicated the investigation. If Montoya had been the killer, police would have had to consider whether he had acted alone or if there were accomplices who had continued his grisly work after his death. However, without definitive proof, Montoya remains only a suspect, and the case remains unsolved. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about the West Mesa Bone Collector case. Some believe that the murders were the work of a serial killer, while others think it could have been part of a larger sex trafficking ring. The involvement of organized crime has also been speculated, though no solid evidence supports this theory. Some investigators have posited that the West Mesa killer may have targeted women involved in sex work because they were more vulnerable and less likely to be reported missing immediately. The transient nature of some of the victims' lifestyles also made it easier for the killer to operate undetected for so long. Despite these theories, no definitive evidence has been found to support any one explanation for the murders. The lack of clear leads and the passage of time have made the investigation extremely challenging. But law enforcement continues to re-examine the case in hopes of finding new evidence that could lead to a breakthrough. One of the key challenges in solving the West Mesa Bone Collector case has been the lack of physical evidence. Because the remains were buried for so many years, much of the forensic evidence that might have been present, such as DNA, fingerprints, or other trace evidence, was either degraded or destroyed. However, advancements in forensic technology have provided new tools for investigators. DNA analysis has become more sophisticated in recent years, and law enforcement has been able to extract DNA from some of the remains. This has allowed investigators to compare the DNA to known suspects and to search for matches in national databases. In addition to DNA analysis, digital forensics and geographic profiling have also been employed in the investigation. By analyzing data related to the victims' last known locations and movements, investigators have attempted to identify patterns that could lead them to the killer. Geographic profiling has been used to narrow down potential areas where the killer may have lived or operated. The West Mesa Bone Collector case has captivated the public's imagination for over a decade, thanks in part to the extensive media coverage it has received. News outlets across the country covered the case when the bodies were first discovered, and the ongoing investigation has been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and articles. The media's coverage of the case has played a significant role in keeping the public's attention on the West Mesa murders. By highlighting the stories of the victims and the efforts of investigators, the media has helped generate leads and keep the case in the spotlight. Documentaries and true crime podcasts have explored various aspects of the case, reigniting interest and speculation with each new piece of information or theory. However, the media's involvement has also had its challenges. The extensive coverage of the case has led to numerous theories and speculations, some of which have been misleading or unhelpful to the investigation. The public's fascination with the case has sometimes resulted in a flood of tips and leads that investigators have had to sift through, many of which have turned out to be dead ends. Despite these challenges, the media continues to play a vital role in keeping the memory of the victims alive and in encouraging the public to come forward with any information that could help solve the case. The emotional toll of the West Mesa Bone Collector case has been immense, not only for the families of the victims but also for the investigators who have dedicated their careers to solving the crime. Many of the detectives who worked on the case from the beginning have since retired, but their commitment to finding justice for the victims remains strong. For the families of the victims, the discovery of their loved ones remains brought a mix of emotions, relief at finally knowing what had happened, but also profound grief at the confirmation of their worst fears. The years of uncertainty had taken a heavy toll on the families, and while they now had answers, the pain of losing their daughters, sisters, and mothers was immeasurable. The investigators who have worked on the case have also faced immense pressure. The frustration of not being able to solve the case despite years of hard work weighs heavily on their shoulders. Many of them have dedicated their careers to finding justice for the victims, and they remain hopeful that one day new evidence will emerge that will lead to a breakthrough. The West Mesa Bone Collector case has had a broader impact on the field of criminal investigation, highlighting the importance of forensic science and the need for continued advancements in technology. As DNA analysis and other forensic tools have become more sophisticated, they have provided new opportunities for solving cold cases that were once thought unsolvable. The case has also underscored the need for law enforcement to prioritize the cases of missing persons, particularly those from marginalized or vulnerable populations. The West Mesa murders have served as a stark reminder that every missing person deserves to have their case thoroughly investigated, regardless of their background or circumstances. In the years since the discovery of the bodies, Albuquerque law enforcement has taken steps to improve its handling of missing persons cases. New protocols have been put in place to ensure that cases are investigated promptly, and resources have been allocated to support the families of missing persons. Despite the progress that has been made in the investigation, many questions about the West Mesa Bone Collector case remain unanswered. Who was responsible for these heinous crimes? Was it a single serial killer, or were there multiple perpetrators involved? What was the motive behind the murders, and how were the victims selected? The lack of definitive answers continues to haunt those who remember the brutal crime. For the families of the victims, the hope for justice remains alive even as the years pass. They continue to advocate for the case to remain a priority for law enforcement, and they refuse to give up on the possibility that the truth will one day be revealed. Investigators also remain committed to solving the case despite the many challenges they face. The passage of time has made the investigation more difficult, as witnesses' memories fade and evidence deteriorates. However, the determination to find answers remains strong, and new leads are still being followed. The search for answers is ongoing, with investigators and the community refusing to give up. While the West Mesa Bone Collector case remains unsolved, advancements in forensic technology and the dedication of law enforcement offer hope that one day, the killers will be brought to justice. In recent years, cold case units across the country have solved decades-old cases using new forensic techniques, and investigators hope that the same will be true for the West Mesa murders. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, could be the key to unlocking the mystery of who killed these women and why. The sun still sets over West Mesa, casting long shadows across the ground where 11 women lay undiscovered for years. Their killer walked among us, shopped in our stores, drove our streets. And while the desert has reclaimed the burial grounds, one chilling question remains: is the bone collector still here? Still watching? Still hunting? Some investigators believe he's dead. Others are convinced he simply evolved, changed his methods, found new hunting grounds. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is this: he could be watching this video right now, reliving his crimes, planning his next victim. The West Mesa Bone Collector remains unidentified. The case remains open. And somewhere out there, 11 families still wait for justice. If you have any information about the West Mesa murders, please contact the authorities. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could be the key to solving this case. Remember to like and subscribe to the Daily Astonishing. See you next time.